The stars stretched out endlessly, a vast sea of pinpricks against the inky blackness, as the Dauntless glided silently through the void. Captain Marlowe Thorne stood at the helm, staring at the distant glimmer of Proxima Centauri B, a faint blue-green orb slowly growing larger on the display screen. This was the culmination of years of preparation, a mission that had been cloaked in secrecy even before it was officially approved, and now they were mere hours away from stepping onto the surface of a world no human had ever touched. 30 minutes to orbit insertion, Sophia Yates, the ship's navigator, announced, her voice breaking the heavy silence in the cockpit. She glanced at Thorne, her eyes betraying a mix of excitement and anxiety. She was the youngest member of the crew, but her sharp instincts and unerring precision had earned her a spot on this mission. Still no response to our hails. "Keep trying," Thorne replied, his tone calm but firm. He was a man used to command, his presence radiating a quiet authority. Beneath his steady exterior, however, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. They were approaching a planet that, according to official records, had never been colonized. Yet here they were, receiving faint, intermittent signals, a language buried under layers of static. Behind him, Dr. Alara Finch adjusted the straps on her harness, her fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. "This is absurd," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "We've crossed 4 light years, and now there's chatter from a supposedly empty planet. How is that possible?" "Maybe someone beat us to the punch," Marcus Wynne, the engineer, said with a smirk. "Or it's just old echoes. The universe loves to mess with us." Ilara shot him a sharp look. "If someone was here before us, we would have known. There's no record of any previous mission." "Enough," Thorne said, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "We're here to find answers, not speculate. Keep your focus." The atmosphere in the cockpit shifted to a tense quiet, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound. Outside, the planet loomed closer, details becoming clearer as they closed the distance. Proxima Centauri B had always been an enigma, potentially habitable, yet bathed in the harsh radiation of its parent star. The prospect of finding life, even the most rudimentary, had been enough to justify the long, perilous journey. But this mission had an added layer of mystery. The faint signals they'd picked up weeks ago were what had accelerated their deployment, prompting a rush of last-minute approvals and vague orders from Earth Command. No one on board could shake the feeling that they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. The ship shuddered slightly as it entered orbit, the artificial gravity adjusting with a low thrum. Sophia's fingers flew across the controls, bringing up a visual of the planet's surface. Vast stretches of barren rock, interrupted by patches of green and blue, filled the screen. But what caught everyone's attention were the shapes, unnatural lines that stood out against the natural landscape. "Are those buildings?" Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. He leaned closer, squinting at the display. "That can't be right." The structures were barely visible at this distance, but there was no mistaking their geometric precision. They stretched out in clusters, forming what looked like a city. Yet, there was something off about them, something that made the skin crawl. The angles were wrong, the lines twisted and intersected in ways that defied logic, as if someone had started to build something familiar and then lost their mind halfway through. "Prepare for descent," Thorne ordered, snapping out of his trance. "I want a closer look." The Dauntless descended through the thin, wispy clouds, engines roaring as it approached the surface. The crew watched in tense silence as the alien structures grew larger, their details coming into sharp, unsettling focus. The buildings, if they could even be called that, seemed to writhe and twist, their surfaces glistening as though covered in a thin film of oil. It was as if they were alive, reacting to the ship's presence. Sophia's hand hovered over the controls, hesitating. "Captain, this doesn't look right. Are we sure we want to land here?" "We came all this way," Thorne said, though even he could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "We're going down." The Dauntless touched down on a flat, rocky plain, the landing gear sinking slightly into the soft red sand. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the silence was shattered by a sudden high-pitched whine, a signal that pierced through the comm system, sending a jolt of pain through everyone's ears. "What the hell was that?" Elara gasped, ripping off her headset. The noise subsided just as quickly as it had started, leaving behind an eerie, oppressive silence. Sophia checked the comms, her hands shaking. It's some kind of beacon," she stammered. "Localized, but I can't pinpoint the source." Before Thorne could respond, a new alert flashed on the display. A proximity sensor had picked up something moving nearby. The feed switched to an external camera showing a blurry, distorted figure at the edge of the landing site. It was humanoid, but its features were indistinct, a smudge against the barren landscape. It stood motionless for a few seconds before melting back into the shadows. "Is that a person?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. "Or something else?" "Stay sharp," Thorne said, his gaze fixed on the screen. "We're going out there. We need answers." The crew gathered their equipment, their movements stiff and mechanical, as if the weight of what they were about to face was already bearing down on them. As they stepped out of the airlock, the atmosphere hit them, a cold, dry wind that carried a faint, metallic tang. The landscape was desolate, stretching out to the horizon in shades of crimson and gray. In the distance, the alien structures loomed, their surfaces glinting in the pale light, like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. They moved cautiously, their footsteps crunching on the sand, scanning the area for any sign of the figure they'd seen. But there was nothing. Just the empty, oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. Then they saw it, half buried in the sand near the edge of the nearest structure. A metal plate, worn and rusted, its surface scratched and dented. Thorne crouched down to get a closer look, brushing away the sand. Words had been carved into the metal, jagged and uneven, as if etched in a frenzy. "We are watching. We never left." Thorne felt a chill run down his spine. The message was old, but the warning felt immediate, like a whisper against the back of his neck. He looked up at the alien structure towering over them, its dark, glassy surface reflecting the sky. For a moment, he thought he saw something move behind the sheen, a fleeting shadow that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "We need to get inside," Elara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know what happened here." Thorne nodded, though every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run. But they had come too far, and the only way was forward. He glanced at his team, their faces pale and drawn, and felt a pang of doubt. Whatever lay ahead, it was nothing they could have prepared for. And yet, they had no choice but to press on, into the unknown, where something was waiting for them in the dark. The alien air was heavy, dense with an unplaceable scent that clung to the back of the throat, like damp earth mixed with rusted metal. As the crew ventured deeper into the settlement, the Dauntless became a shrinking dot against the vast, empty expanse of Proxima's surface. The structures loomed ahead, dark and imposing, their shapes bending at odd angles, casting jagged shadows that looked more like claws than buildings. Captain Thorne led the way, his helmet's flashlight slicing through the gloom. The closer they got, the more bizarre the architecture became. What had appeared from orbit as a standard colony outpost was something much stranger up close. The buildings were constructed from a material that looked organic, almost like bone, intertwined with metal beams that spiraled and twisted in ways that made no sense. The surfaces were slick, reflecting their lights in distorted ripples, as if they were walking through a funhouse mirror. "This place is wrong," Marcus muttered, his voice crackling over the comms. He tapped a gloved hand against the nearest wall, which gave a soft, hollow thud. "It doesn't feel stable." "It shouldn't be here at all," Dr. Caldwell said, his tone unnaturally calm but with a sharp edge of curiosity. "No record of any official colony. No plans to build whatever this is." Ilara glanced around nervously, her eyes flicking to the shadows. "What if it's not a colony?" she asked. "What if this is something else?" The suggestion hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. They had all been thinking it, but hadn't dared to say it out loud. The idea that this place might not have been made by humans, or at least not by any humans they understood, was beginning to take root. Sophia, who had been walking at the rear, suddenly froze. "Hold up," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you hear that?" The team stopped, straining to listen. At first, there was only the howl of the wind, rattling through the strange structures. But then, faint and rhythmic, there was a sound like scratching, almost like something scraping against metal. It was coming from somewhere ahead, echoing through the empty corridors. Thorne motioned for the group to move forward, his hand hovering over the sidearm at his hip. As they advanced, the sound grew louder, more distinct, like fingernails dragging across a chalkboard. The corridors became narrower, forcing them to walk single file, and the walls seemed to close in on them, bending and curving as if they were being funneled deeper into the settlement. Finally, they emerged into an open space, a vast chamber that looked like a makeshift laboratory. Rusted, outdated equipment was strewn across the floor, wires snaking in every direction. There were broken monitors, shattered glass tubes, and strange organic growths sprouting from the walls, pulsating softly like they were breathing. The scratching noise stopped the moment they entered, plunging the room into a heavy silence. "Jesus," Marcus breathed. "What happened here?" Ilara moved cautiously towards a desk littered with papers, most of them torn and stained. She picked up one of the sheets, squinting at the faded, handwritten notes. "These are in English," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "It looks like lab records. They were studying something." "Studying what?" Thorne asked, stepping closer. "Life forms," Ilara replied, flipping through the brittle pages. "There are references to samples from beneath the surface. They found something down there and they were trying to analyze it." Caldwell's eyes lit up. "Do the notes say what kind of life? Bacterial, plant, animal?" Before Ilara could answer, Marcus called out from across the room, "Hey, I've got something over here." He was standing next to a series of old, rusted crates, partially buried under a collapsed shelf. He pried one open, revealing a stack of data disks. "Looks like recordings. Maybe we can get these to play." Sophia hurried over, her hands already working to connect a portable data reader to the disk. The screen flickered for a moment before a video file began to play, the image grainy and distorted. A man's face appeared, gaunt and weary, eyes sunken into dark hollows. He looked as though he hadn't slept in weeks, his skin pallid under the harsh artificial light. "This is Dr. Samuel Rhodes, Chief Biologist, Proxima Research Outpost," the man began, his voice barely above a whisper, crackling through the static. "If anyone finds this, you need to understand what we're dealing with. We've made a mistake." The screen cut to a series of images, blurry and unfocused, showing what appeared to be a cavern deep beneath the planet's surface. Strange, spindly structures jutted out from the walls, almost like coral, but dark and twisted, with tendrils curling towards the camera. "We thought we could contain it," Dr. Rhodes continued, his voice shaking. "It started as just a few samples, strange crystalline organisms that seemed dormant at first, but then they started growing, adapting. We didn't realize until it was too late that they weren't just reacting to our presence. They were aware. They were learning." The screen flickered again, this time showing the same lab where the crew stood, but it was different. Brighter, cleaner, and full of activity. People moved in and out of the frame, some wearing lab coats, others in protective suits, their faces obscured by masks. There was a low hum in the background, punctuated by the occasional sharp beep of machines. Then people started hearing things. Rhodes's voice was barely audible now, strained with fear. Whispers like something was trying to speak to them. We thought it was just stress, but it wasn't. The voices were real. They started telling us things we shouldn't know. It's like it was inside our heads. The video cut off abruptly, leaving only a blank screen and a low, static hiss. Sophia scrambled to play the next file, but it was corrupted, displaying only brief flashes of light and shadow, accompanied by distorted, echoing sounds that almost resembled laughter. "I don't like this," Marcus said, his voice tight. "We should leave." But before anyone could respond, the scratching noise returned, louder this time, coming from the far end of the chamber. They turned as one, their flashlights sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there, just shadows shifting in the corners, as if the darkness itself was alive. Thorne's heart pounded, and he raised his weapon, feeling the cold metal against his palm. "Fan out," he ordered. "Stay alert." They moved slowly, scanning the room, their lights bouncing off the walls. As they approached the source of the noise, they found a large steel door, sealed shut with heavy rusted locks. The surface was covered in scratches, long jagged lines that crisscrossed each other. It looked like someone, or something, had been trying to claw its way out. "What the hell is behind this?" Marcus whispered, taking a step back. Caldwell reached out to touch the door, his hand hovering just above the cold metal. "Something they were keeping out, or in," he said softly. "Either way, they didn't want it getting loose." "Maybe we should turn back," Alara said, her voice quivering. "We have enough to report to command. We can—" "No," Thorne interrupted. "We're here to find out what happened. We can't leave until we know." The rest of the team hesitated, but they knew there was no arguing with him. Thorn stepped forward, examining the locks. "Let's get this open. Carefully." It took several minutes of work, but finally the rusted metal gave way, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passage leading further underground. The air was colder here, carrying a faint, sickly sweet smell that made their stomachs churn. As they stepped inside, their flashlights caught glimpses of strange, twisted shapes embedded in the walls, like veins of dark crystal. The passage sloped downward, leading them deeper, and with each step the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if they were wading through a viscous fog. And then they saw them. Figures, frozen in place, scattered across the floor of a cavernous room. Dozens of them hunched over, their faces contorted in expressions of sheer terror, hands raised as if to shield themselves from some unseen horror. They were all wearing the same uniform, the insignia of the Proxima research outpost, barely visible beneath layers of dust and grime. "Dear God," Ilara whispered, her voice breaking. "They're petrified." Thorn stepped forward, shining his light on the nearest figure. The eyes were wide open, glassy, reflecting the beam like dark, empty mirrors. There was no mistaking it. They had died in agony, but what could have caused such a fate? As they looked closer, they saw that one of the petrified bodies was clutching something, a small black orb, its surface smooth and unblemished, pulsating faintly with an otherworldly glow. Thorn reached out, his fingers barely grazing the surface when the orb flickered, and a voice crackled through the comms, faint but unmistakable, echoing in a chorus of whispers. "We never left." The lights in the chamber flickered, plunging them into darkness for a heartbeat. When they came back on, the petrified faces seemed to be staring directly at them, their hollow eyes unblinking, mouths slightly open as if they were about to scream. Thorn pulled back, his heart hammering. "We need to get out of here," he said, but his voice sounded distant, muffled, as if he were hearing it from underwater. "Now." But as they turned to leave, they realized the passage they had come through was gone. Only a solid wall of dark, glistening crystal remained, blocking their exit, trapping them in the cold, suffocating dark of the underground chamber. And somewhere, far beneath their feet, something stirred. The dark underground chamber was suffocating, pressing in on the crew like a vice. Thorn's flashlight beam cut through the blackness, but it did nothing to ease the dread creeping through his chest. The air was thick, heavy with a metallic tang that made every breath feel like swallowing nails. The solid wall of crystal had sealed them in, blocking the only exit they had found. There was no going back, only forward, deeper into the labyrinth beneath the abandoned settlement. "Captain, we need to leave," Ilara said, her voice barely masking the edge of panic. "Whatever's down here, it's not natural. We can't leave until we find a way out," Thorn interrupted, more harshly than he intended. He could feel the tension like a live wire running through his team. It wouldn't take much to snap it. "Stay focused. We'll find another exit." But even he knew the words rang hollow. The dark had a way of twisting things, warping the mind, and he could feel it tightening around them, like a predator toying with its prey. Sophia's voice crackled over the comms, shaky and distorted. "I keep hearing whispers," she said, her flashlight darting nervously across the walls. "I thought it was just the comms glitching, but it's not. It's like they're coming from inside my head." "Stop it," Marcus snapped, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the control pad. Just stop. We can't lose it now. We have to." He was cut off by a sudden high-pitched noise, a keening wail that echoed through the chamber, piercing their ears. Everyone froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the sound. For a moment, it was like the world had stopped, the air vibrating with that unearthly, bone-chilling note. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise died away, leaving a ringing silence. Thorn's heart pounded in his chest. Did anyone see where that came from? No one answered. Instead, Caldwell stepped forward, his eyes locked on something at the far end of the chamber. "There's another passage," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "It wasn't there before." The rest of the team turned to look. Sure enough, a narrow opening had appeared, framed by the dark crystal, leading deeper underground. It was as if the tunnel had simply unfolded from the wall, revealing itself, beckoning them forward. Every instinct told Thorn to turn back, to get his team out of there, but they were trapped. The only way out was through. "Keep moving," Thorn ordered, trying to keep his voice steady. "We don't stop until we find another way to the surface." They entered the passage, their footsteps echoing off the cold, slick walls. The further they went, the more the tunnel seemed to bend and twist, like a serpent coiling around them. The walls were covered in the same dark, crystalline growths, pulsing faintly, as if alive. Thorn kept his eyes forward, trying not to focus on the shapes he thought he saw moving at the edges of his vision. They hadn't been walking long when Sophia stopped suddenly, her flashlight fixed on something ahead. "What is that?" Ahead of them, the tunnel opened up into another chamber, smaller and circular, with walls covered in what looked like tangled roots of crystal, woven together in a lattice. In the center stood a large cylindrical tank filled with a thick, murky fluid. Floating inside was something that looked almost human. A pale, emaciated figure, its limbs twisted and elongated as if it had been stretched beyond its limits. The thing's eyes were open, staring out at them, unblinking, its mouth slightly open in a silent scream. Ilara stepped back, her face pale. "Oh my God!" Sophia's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. "Is that one of the colonists?" Dr. Caldwell approached the tank, his curiosity overcoming his fear. "It's not possible. The biological structure is all wrong. Whatever this is, it's been altered." He pointed to the thin, wiry tendrils that extended from the figure's limbs, burrowing into the crystal walls. "Look at this. It's like it's been integrated into the environment." As they stared, the murky fluid in the tank began to bubble, and the figure's eyes flickered, focusing on them. Its mouth moved, forming silent words, but no sound escaped. Sophia stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror. No, this isn't real." "It's not alive," Marcus said, though his voice wavered. "It can't be." Thorn stepped closer, despite the warning alarms blaring in his head. "What did you do?" he whispered, as if expecting the figure to answer. And then it did. A low, garbled voice, distorted and echoing, filled the chamber, the sound seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We watched. We learned." The voice was not human. It was a guttural, inhuman growl, layered over with an electronic hum, as if 1,000 voices were speaking in unison. The lights in the chamber flickered, and the crystal walls seemed to shiver like a great beast rousing from slumber. Thorn stumbled back, his mind reeling. "What the hell is this?" The voice spoke again, and this time there was no mistaking the words. We were them. Now. They are us. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. The thing in the tank wasn't a colonist. It was something else. Something that had taken the colonists and made them a part of itself. The implications twisted Thorne's stomach. Whatever had happened here, whatever was down in these tunnels, it was alive, and it was waiting for them. Suddenly, the lights in the chamber flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their own ragged breathing, and then, in the pitch black, they heard it. The scratching, scraping noise, louder now, coming from every direction. Sophia screamed, the sound echoing through the chamber, and Thorne whipped his flashlight around, trying to find the source. The beam landed on something moving along the walls, figures, shadowy and indistinct, scuttling along the crystalline surfaces like spiders. They moved in unnatural, jerking motions, limbs bending at impossible angles, their bodies half hidden by the darkness. "Back up!" Thorne shouted, raising his weapon. "Back up, now!" But as they tried to retreat, the passage they had come through was no longer there. The tunnel had sealed itself off, leaving them trapped in the small, claustrophobic chamber. The figures on the walls crept closer, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark, reflecting the light like predators stalking prey. "They're all around us," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "They've been here this whole time, watching us." The shadows converged, closing in, and as the light from their flashlights flickered, Thorne caught a glimpse of what they truly were: twisted, contorted faces, mouths frozen in silent screams, their skin melded with the crystal walls like flies caught in amber. Some were missing eyes, others had limbs that had been fused together, and all of them wore expressions of horror, as if they had died screaming. "We have to move," Thorne shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. And then the whispers began. Soft, insidious, they slithered into their ears, bypassing the comms, bypassing everything, as if they were being spoken directly into their minds. "We see you. We are you. There is no escape." Elara clutched her head, her hands trembling. "Get out of my head. Get out," she whimpered, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of the damned. Images flashed before their eyes, nightmarish visions of the colonists being dragged into the crystal, their bodies stretching and twisting, reshaped into something unrecognizable. Faces that shifted and melted, eyes that stared, accusing, as they were swallowed whole. Thorne tried to block out the images, but they were inescapable. He saw himself reflected in the crystal, but it wasn't him, it was someone else, someone wearing his face, eyes blank and lifeless. He turned to call out to the others, but they were gone, their forms swallowed by the dark. And then he saw her, Elara, standing at the edge of the chamber, her back to him. "Elara?" he called, his voice shaking. "What are you doing?" She didn't respond. Slowly, she turned, and Thorne's blood ran cold. Her face was blank, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. When she spoke, it was not her voice, but that same distorted, inhuman chorus. "We are all one. You will be too." Without warning, Elara's body contorted, limbs bending and snapping, her form twisting into an unnatural, angular shape. She lurched toward him, her movements jerky and erratic, like a marionette on tangled strings. Thorne stumbled back, his flashlight flickering, and in the dim light he saw the others, Sophia, Marcus, Caldwell, all of them standing still, their eyes vacant, their bodies shifting, merging with the dark, crystalline growths that had been creeping ever closer. The chamber was alive, breathing, pulsing with the rhythm of the whispers, and the figures that had been hidden in the shadows began to emerge, moving closer, their eyes glowing like embers. The walls were closing in, the crystal veins throbbing, and the last thing Thorn heard before the darkness consumed him was the voice, the horrible, echoing voice. "You came to find us. Now you are ours." And the whispers surrounded him, wrapping him in their cold embrace, dragging him down into the dark where the nightmares waited. Darkness. It was all Thorn could see, an endless, suffocating void pressing in from all sides, seeping into his mind. The whispers had gone silent, replaced by a low, rhythmic pulse that thrummed through the walls, through his bones, like a heartbeat. It was as if the entire planet was alive, breathing, watching. For a moment, he couldn't remember who he was, where he was. Then, with a sudden clarity that hit like a jolt of electricity, it all came flooding back. Dauntless. The mission, the abandoned settlement, the cold, dead faces of the colonists, and his crew, his friends, lost to the dark. "Captain," a voice rasped through the comms, weak, barely recognizable. "Captain, help." Thorn's head snapped up, his flashlight flickering feebly, cutting through the shadows. The chamber was vast, a cavern that seemed to stretch on forever, with crystalline walls that glistened like wet stone, throbbing with that steady, pulsing rhythm. And there, lying against the wall, half merged with the dark, shimmering veins, was Marcus. His skin was pale, translucent, and where his limbs should have been, there were dark, jagged tendrils snaking out from the crystal and burrowing into his flesh. Thorn's breath caught in his throat. "Marcus, what did they do to you?" They're inside me," Marcus gasped, his voice strained with agony. "I can feel them. Like worms crawling under my skin. They're not letting me go, Captain." Thorn's heart twisted, the sight of his friend's mangled form tearing at him. "I'm going to get you out of here," he said, though the words felt hollow, a lie even as they left his mouth. He moved closer, but Marcus shook his head violently, his eyes wide with terror. "No, don't come near me," he wheezed. It hurts. They're in my head, Thorn. I can't make them stop." The pulse quickened, a throbbing beat that rattled the chamber, and Thorn could feel it in his own chest, like a drum keeping time with his heart. It was everywhere, seeping into his thoughts, twisting them. He had to focus, had to keep moving. But the darkness was shifting, the shadows coalescing, and he realized with a sickening lurch that the walls weren't just glistening. They were moving, like the surface of a still pond disturbed by a ripple. He raised his flashlight and the beam caught something, someone moving in the dark. Sophia. She stood at the edge of the chamber, her head bowed, her hands hanging limp at her sides. "Sophia," he called out, but she didn't respond. She was staring at the ground as if transfixed, her body swaying gently. Thorn moved closer, his heart pounding, and as he drew near, he saw what she was looking at. There, on the ground, was the black orb they had found in the lab, now half submerged in the crystal. It pulsated with the same dark rhythm, and from it, tendrils stretched out, burrowing deep into the earth, feeding into the walls. The whispers were back, faint, barely audible, but growing louder, filling his head with a cacophony of voices. It sees, it learns, it becomes. He reached out to touch Sophia's shoulder, and she finally lifted her head. Her eyes were black, the pupils swallowed by an endless void, and when she spoke, it was not her voice, but the voice of many, echoing from deep within her throat. "You shouldn't have come here, Captain." Thorn recoiled, the flashlight shaking in his grip. "Sophia, what did they do to you?" "They showed me the truth," she said, her mouth curving into a sad, distant smile. "We thought we could come here and find answers, but this place, it's older than anything we could understand. It was waiting for us, and when we arrived, it opened its eyes." "What truth?" Thorn demanded, his voice barely steady. "What the hell is this thing?" Sophia tilted her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "It's a mirror," she said. "A mirror that reflects everything it touches. The colonists, they wanted to study it, understand it, but it understood them first. It learned how to speak, how to think, how to be, and it was hungry." Thorn's hands tightened around the flashlight. "We need to get out of here. We need to—" "Get out?" Sophia interrupted, and now her voice was mocking, almost playful. "Captain, there is no out. It's already too late. Don't you see? We are part of it now. It's inside us, and we're inside it. There is no escape because there is nowhere it doesn't exist." "Marcus, Sophia, Caldwell, we need to move. Thorn turned, but the others were already gone, swallowed by the dark. He was alone, standing in the center of the chamber, and he could feel the presence bearing down on him, its attention, its awareness, like a spotlight cutting through the black. The orb flickered, and suddenly, Thorn was no longer in the chamber. He was back on Earth, standing in his childhood home, the familiar smell of warm bread and cedar filling his nostrils. He could see his mother sitting at the kitchen table, her back to him, her hair glowing in the sunlight. It was impossible. She had been dead for years. But here she was, humming softly, a song he hadn't heard since he was a boy. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking, Is that you?" She turned, and for a moment everything felt real, like he had stepped out of a nightmare and into a memory. But when she smiled, he saw it. The same black, endless eyes, and her mouth twisted into that horrible, knowing grin. "You can't escape, Marlowe," she said. And now her voice was not her own. It was the voice of the entity, the voice of Proxima, echoing through time and space. "You've already been consumed." The image shattered, and he was back in the dark, the shadows swirling around him, closing in. The figures, Marcus, Sophia, Caldwell, the colonists, they circled him, their faces blank, their bodies moving in unison, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. Thorn felt his knees buckle, and he fell, the flashlight clattering to the ground, its beam cutting through the dark in erratic arcs. The whispers grew louder, deafening, drowning out his thoughts. "We are one. We are all. You cannot leave." Thorn's vision blurred, and he realized with a growing horror that he could feel something crawling under his skin, like cold, sharp needles burrowing deeper, weaving into his flesh. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The entity was inside him, peeling away his memories, his thoughts stripping him down to nothing. Why? He thought, the question echoing weakly in his mind. Why us? The answer came, clear and cold, a voice that resonated through every cell of his being. Because you came, because you sought to understand, because you could not leave well enough alone. And then he saw it, the truth, the horrible, beautiful truth. Proxima was not just a planet, not just a place. It was a mind, a vast, ancient consciousness drifting through the void, seeking, learning. It had found the colonists, absorbed them, and now it had found the crew of the Dauntless. It had reached across the light years, across the stars, and it would not stop. It would learn everything there was to know until there was nothing left that it did not possess. Thorn's body trembled, his mind unraveling, as the entity's thoughts merged with his own. He could feel it spreading out, reaching across the universe, stretching into the endless dark, pulling everything into itself. The voices, the faces, all of them swallowed, absorbed, lost in the vast, endless sea of consciousness. And then, as if in a final act of mercy, the dark embraced him, the whispers fading to a dull, gentle hum. Thorn felt himself slipping away, dissolving, until there was nothing left but a hollow, empty shell. "Rest," the voice whispered, soft and soothing, like a lullaby. "Rest and become part of the whole. You are not alone. You will never be alone again." And as the last flicker of his consciousness was consumed, as the final shred of Marlowe Thorn disappeared into the vast, cold intelligence that was Proxima, he realized the awful truth. There would be no escape, not for him, not for anyone, because Proxima was not just a place. It was a prison, a mirror, a hunger that would never be sated, and it was already reaching out across the stars for more.